Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon on construction safety. Just as we've done in the past, I would like to remind everybody that we do have everyone muted to cut down on background noise. However, if you'd like to ask any questions of our presenter today, you can enter those into your chat box and we'll get those answered either during the course of the presentation or the webinar, or immediately following the webinar. If anybody needs a certificate for the Ohio BWC 2-hour safety credit, please send me an email at rich@cardinalhs.net, and I will make sure that I get those over to you. My name is Rich Barkham. I'm the owner of Cardinal Compliance Consultants, and I will be moderating the webinar today, but our primary speaker is going to be Jim Morris. Jim is a certified safety professional with Cardinal Compliance Consultants, has about 8 years of experience, most of which is in the construction and the oil and gas industry. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jim here. And we'll take it from there. Jim?
All right. So today what we're going to talk about, we're going to be focused on construction safety. And no, I'm not going to cover the entirety of the 1926 standards. Kind of what we're doing today is this. We're going to take a higher elevation look at construction safety. So here's what we're going to talk about today. One, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about just the nature of construction and hazards we find in construction. And yes, a lot of the hazards that I'm going to talk about today, you can find them in just about any industry. However, construction is a little bit different of an animal. Now, what I'm also going to talk about is what OSHA calls the Focus 4 hazards, and these are 4 areas where the majority of our fatalities come from in construction, as well as I want to talk a little bit about site safety plans. Now, every company is going to have a safety manual. They're going to have their standard operating procedures. What a site safety plan is, really, it's just a document that explains how are we going to implement this safety manual, this safety program on our site. And finally, I want to talk about enforcement. Now, a lot of people think enforcement is when you write someone up, when you discipline somebody. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And how culture plays a role in enforcement, how people's responsibilities at their given position, how that influences enforcement, and finally, what is the actual definition of enforcement. So let's talk about hazards within the construction industry. Now, here's what makes it a different animal in my mind. It's the fact that hazards constantly change, all right? Regardless of the task that you're doing, regardless of your trade. Now you can do task XYZ today, and then this afternoon you perform the same tasks, but the hazard changes a little bit. All right, and so you're going to find this one every single industry. The specific hazards are going to change. For instance, if I'm working light commercial construction, my fall hazards are going to be different than if I'm doing heavy civil work. If I'm participating in steel erection, it's going to change the degree of hazard. Now, equipment operating, for instance, somebody operating a Bobcat, just building a standard strip mall. I'm worried about hitting other equipment, hitting people, damaging the building itself. Whereas if I'm working in refining, I'm a little bit more concerned with not just that, but what if we hit an H2S sample point where it's coming out 10,000 parts per million? So every industry, those construction hazards can change. And even, project-specific hazards. Every project is going to be unique. Every project is going to be different. You're going to have different rules. And again, those same hazards are going to manifest themselves a little bit differently. And on top of that, unsafe behaviors. When you're in construction, you're relying on a lot of things to keep people safe. You have to have good rules. You have to have good enforcement. You pull a lot of that from your safety program, your safety manual, and your site plan. But here's the reality. You're not relying just on having good processes, good rules, good enforcement, but you're relying on people to make good decisions consistently. Now, I don't believe anybody sets out to be unsafe. That's just reality. I don't think there are too many people out there, Rich, that say, I want to get hurt today. However, people have different perspectives. Some people, you know, a little more risk averse than others. Take an iron worker, for instance. That is somebody who has no problem working several hundred feet in the air, walking iron, and that is an extreme fall hazard. Now, you know, that perspective is going to be a little bit different. Some people are going to see the hazards of working with a grinder a little more clearly than someone else. So when I talk about construction hazards and the fact that the hazards change consistently and constantly, you rely on people to make good decisions. And if you've ever heard any of our webinars, at some point you've heard Rich or myself say, people are dumb, all right? And it's just, again, it's not that people try to be unsafe, but it happens. Now, within construction, we have what OSHA refers to as our focus 4 hazards. Now, these are electrical, falls, struck by, and caught between. And these are the areas where we find the most fatalities as a result of, you know, poor policies, poor decision making. So I want to talk about these for a few minutes. Now, electrical, look at these statistics here, and this is, you know, I don't want to call fatality statistics good, but if you look at 2016, 82 construction workers died as a result of contacting electrical current. Now, in 2009, 121 workers died, so that's a huge drop from 2009 to 2016. And a lot of that comes from awareness. You know, it's one thing to be aware of a hazard, aware that electrical could hurt you. It's a whole nother perspective you have when you actually recognize that hazard. You see that hazard, you understand that can hurt you, you can locate that hazard. You know, the point that you see that hazard, you're a lot more likely to ask, what can I do to work safely? Now, in construction, we have several examples here of the types of hazards we can have with electrical. Now, improper grounding, and there's a lot of definitions of improper grounding. What I want to focus on is, let's say, tool usage. Now, there's two types of tools that you're going to find, power tools that is. You're going to find some that are grounded and some that are double insulated. Now, when you're working with a tool that has a ground prong, here's the way that works, all right? Electricity at low voltage is looking for the path of least resistance. So let's say your tool has a short in it and it comes in contact with the casing of the tool where you're holding. So electricity has two places it can go. It can go through your skin in your hand. It can go through your body, going from your hand to your arm, down your torso, down your leg, and through your foot. And that is a path electricity can take. Now, there's going to be some resistance there. Or it can take a second path and go through that ground prong, which is going to be copper wire. So that being said, that's going to be a lot less resistance. Now, if your tools are damaged, if you're missing ground prongs, you know what, at this point, you're going to become a human ground prong. All right? Now, exposed electrical parts, sometimes some of the facilities we work in, you know, we may demo out a portion of the facility and then, you know, and then begin the construction phase. Well, if we have existing electrical panels and somebody's removed portions of the panel, you know, we have that exposure right there. Or inadequate wiring, and we'll talk about that briefly in a few minutes, but there's a lot of codes out there that dictate how are we supposed to wire equipment. And when we, with good intentions, try to wire systems up ourselves when we're not qualified, again, we create that exposure. Now, in construction, we're going to have crane lifts. We're going to work near existing power lines. Several years ago on a site in North Carolina, and there was a young gentleman, he was about 21 years old, It was his first job in construction. He was an apprentice pipe fitter, and he was asked to hold a tagline. Now, the reason I remember this is because I used to have coffee with the gentleman occasionally and just chat with him a little bit. I didn't know him that well, but I knew him. Now, on a very wet, humid day, there's been a lot of rain. While he's holding a tagline that is just soaked, it's very wet. They got a little bit too close to a power line, and it arced, and it killed him. You know, we have to work around power lines, and it's something we get very, very comfortable with in construction. Now, damaged insulation, and that can be, you know, the cord on your tool, that can be an extension cord, that can be your welding leads, but when they're damaged, whether it's just the outer insulation or whether it's the outer and the inner, you know, at that point, again, we have that potential exposure. And something that you hear a lot of safety people talk about, and a lot of people don't understand the hazard of a daisy chain. What that is where I have, let's say, a three-way splitter and an extension cord running to that. Well, sometimes, let's face it, three receptacles is just not enough. And if you ever put up Christmas lights, you run into that problem where you just don't have enough plugs. So you put in to that three-way splitter, maybe an additional three-way splitter. Well, you know, if you keep doing that, eventually you're going to overload that circuit. That's going to create heat that becomes a fire hazard. And again, that's something a lot of people in construction, they just don't quite recognize. And what makes all of this worse, whether you have improper grounding, a damaged tool, exposed electrical, you know what, in construction, we work outside and it gets hot, it gets cold, it rains, and that doesn't always shut us down, which is exactly why I do construction safety, because once it starts raining, I have an excuse to go inside. But again, that just, you know what, that compounds the hazards that we have, because that's Mother Nature putting a conductor on the ground. Now, this chart, and I'm assuming most of us have seen this, but I just want to run through it for a few minutes. So 1 milliamp, that's the point where you can barely feel it. Now, when we start going a little bit higher, you know, we hit 15, 16 milliamps. You know, this is the point where we can't let go. Now, there's a right way and there's a wrong way to test if a line is hot. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's easy, lick it. You are wrong. If you are licking things in construction, it's time to find a new trade. But that being said, all right, so when you lose your ability to let go, if you've ever seen an electrician test a wire with the back of his hand, there's a reason he's using the back of his hand. You see, if he uses the front and it's live and it's 16 milliamps, he's not going to be able to let go. Whereas if he touches it with the back of his hand, you know, when his hand seizes up, he's not holding on to it. So that's only about 16 milliamps. It's not very much. Now, as we move up, you know, 20 to 30 milliamps, that's where we're going to start having trouble breathing. 100 milliamps is all it's going to take to start throwing off the rhythm of your heart. Now, at 2 amps, this is where we can do significant organ damage. This is where we start getting into that potential. Now, if you look at the figure to the right, okay, a couple different factors that are going to determine the internal injuries you're going to have. And remember, you're always going to have an entry wound, you're going to have an exit wound, but you're going to have internal damage as well. So the path that electricity takes through your body, and if you look at, you know, let's say the blue line, all right, going into your head, through your chest, down your legs. Now, remember, yes, the human body is made of water, but it is not a perfect conductor. So as it runs into resistance, what is it going to do? All right, it's going to start heating up. Now, back to the human body's made of water. What does water do when it gets hot? It turns into steam. So think of it this way. It's almost like you're steaming yourself from the inside. All right, now, again, 2 amps, that's where we start getting to the point that that's going to happen. Now, look at that bottom statement down there, circular saws. They use around, give or take, 15 amps. So a circular saw, we use those every day in construction, all right? You're always going to have carpenters on the site. That is well above the threshold for doing damage At this point, a single power tool has enough power to kill you. And a lot of tradesmen don't quite recognize this because, again, we get comfortable with the hazards around us, and we're not always trained to recognize these hazards. So just a few examples of some of the sources of hazards we can have. You know, the top picture there, just an extension cord. The outer insulation is damaged in several places. I have to assume the inner insulation is damaged. Now, a lot of people will ignore this. You know, it's a given that you're going to inspect your tools prior to the shift, before you use them. But reality, that's perfect world. Even though we tell people to inspect their tools, again, back to relying on people to make good decisions consistently. So that being said, plenty of people are not always going to make that good decision. They're not going to inspect their tools, their work area, and that's where we have damaged insulation or exposed wire that's just not noticed. And if you look at the bottom right picture there, you know, again, I'm not an electrician. I'm just a stupid safety guy, not qualified to wire anything up. But if you look at that jumbled mess, there is no way that meets the National Electric Code. So that being said, we have those exposures. A lot of times it's with well-meaning people, but we make bad decisions, right? And it just gets worse depending on the location we're working. If it's wet, raining, if it's humid outside, that hazard that we may receive a shock just starts going through the roof. Now, there's a lot of controls we can put in place, and some of these are very basic in construction. If you've never heard of a GFCI, you know, that's just a plug you'll see in your kitchen, in your bathroom, anywhere that we have water sources. And basically what that does is it measures how much energy is, boom, flowing into the system. Then it compares it to how much energy is moving out. And when it notices a difference, that GFCI realizes, hey, we're leaking electricity somewhere, something's happened. So it shuts off the flow of power within a split second. So that doesn't stop you from getting a shock. What that does is it minimizes the shock, all right, the duration of the shock. Now, OSHA says you have to have one of two things in construction. If you're working outside, you have to have a GFCI or assured grounding. Now, what assured grounding is, this is where we inspect our tools. We expect our cords, our leads, to make sure that there's no damage. Now, the purpose of assured grounding is this: reduce the chance that we could get that shock. Now, while I naturally lean towards the idea of assured grounding and reducing the chance of a shock, you know, it's typically what you're going to find the industry best practice is to use GFCIs and you know, follow assured grounding. Now, assured grounding is typically mandated every 3 months, every quarter. A competent person has to go inspect the equipment, inspect our tools, and make sure that they're properly grounded, that we're not setting ourselves up, whether through damage or missing ground prongs, that we're not setting ourselves up for a shock. Now, you'll find some companies, they'll do this on a monthly basis, but federal OSHA only requires it, you know, every quarter. So just one thing to remember when you're stepping onto a job site, you know, check your site plan, check your company policies, and check the construction manager's policies, because a lot of times you'll find they're a little bit stricter than what OSHA is going to say. Now, when it comes to poor wiring, you know, the National Electric Code, that's the standard that electricians are going to follow. Now, that being said, this is why it's important to have qualified electricians do your electrical work and do your any type of repair you have on electric tools. And then finally, distance. You know, when you're working with a power line, the further you are away, the less likely it's going to arc. So, you know, just consider these things with any electrical hazards you may be exposed to on your job site. Now, falls, again, it's the nature of construction that things are going to change. Now, when you think about it, again, look at my picture on the lower right. So this carpenter is trying to frame out a wall. Now, he has a fall hazard just to the right of him. Now, a lot of times in certain facilities, or really in most facilities, the thought process is, I need to get rid of that fall hazard. And I agree with that. But the nature, again, of construction is, as we build new hazards occur that we have to work around. And sometimes we're able to engineer out that hazard. Sometimes we're able to place a cover over that floor hole, but at the same time, sometimes we have to find a way to work around it. Now, in 2016, and this is a statistic that definitely scares me a little bit working in construction. We start off working below ground, doing underground. As we go up, those fall hazards increase. And in 2016, 384 construction workers were involved in fatal falls. That is little over 1/3 of construction fatalities right there. And that's why, again, it's important. When you're training employees, when you're writing site plans, you're preparing for a new project, or you're on an existing project, you want to make sure that this is something you're looking at, because this is one of those things, if somebody well-intentioned does the right thing 99.9% of the time, makes that one mistake that one time, that can be a life-changing event. That could be their death right there. So every construction project, regardless of what phase you're in, you're going to have fall hazards. If you're at the point of doing civil underground, dirt work, you have fall hazards. Now, you may not see them as significant, but, there was a company I worked for years ago, and it was a gentleman. He was working on the first rung of a ladder, so he's maybe a foot off the ground. That's it. Now, no one knows what happened. Maybe he got dizzy, lost his balance, he fell backwards, hit his head. That fall from 1 foot, it didn't kill him, but for the better part of a year, best way I can describe him, it was like the lights were on, but nobody was home. All right, it did significant damage to his life. That was a year he was unable to work, and that was just the point, a year when he was first starting to really be able to recognize family members, to be able to start really beginning the path to recovery. So again, as we move up, those fall hazards just increase. We have to build scaffolding on most projects, so that way we can have a safe place to walk to work. Now think about that. We have scaffold builders putting up scaffolding. If you've ever watched a scaffold builder, it's amazing the effort they have to put in to using fall protection to protect themselves. Because think about it. As you're building that scaffolding, you don't have a stable place to stand. You really have limited options on where you can tie off, where you can connect your fall protection. And these employees, this trade is working this way to try to provide other construction workers, a safe place to work. And so again, as you think about it, perfect world, yes, we put up barricades with man lifts, but that becomes very infeasible very quickly. And even if we were to do that, that'd be a very difficult build right there. And so again, as we move up, if you've ever worked around iron workers, they truly are a special breed within construction. Once I get to the around 5-6 foot in the air, that's where I start getting nervous. At that point, I am ready to get my feet back on the ground. Whereas an iron worker, the higher they go, the more they enjoy their job. They're surrounded by fall hazards daily, right? So I want you to remember, whether we're working off ladders, walking up and down stairs, working off scaffolds, building scaffolds, in construction, we have a lot of fall hazards, and they don't go away as we from the beginning to the end of that project, we always have fall hazards. Now, as I mentioned with the ladder, you don't have to fall very far to get hurt. Just falling a foot, 2 foot, even just tripping, if you have something, for instance, this rebar sticking out of the ground, if you look at that employee standing right in front of it, if he was to fall, that's an impalement hazard. And so it's not just hitting the ground in that sudden stop. It's what are we going to hit on our way down? What are we going to hit when we do hit the ground? So, struck by again, this is another statistic that has dropped significantly over the better part of the past 10 years. You know, back in 2009, throughout general industry and construction, there were 414 deaths as a result of struck by. And in construction, the majority of those were construction, 272. Now, since OSHA's really started pushing focus forward, the idea of that, outreach trainers have been pushing that. 2016, there was only 93 fatalities as a result by struck by. Now, most people, when I talk about struck by, here's what they think of. They think of equipment or trucks hitting other equipment or trucks, or they think of pedestrians getting hurt and killed. And you know what? That is a huge exposure in the construction industry, because there's all sorts of powered equipment, and they all have blind spots, and they all have backup alarms. But you know what? When you hear that day in, day out, you know, you become deaf to it, because you're just so accustomed to hearing it. And so that's what people think about. But you know, when I talk about struck by, that includes falling objects. All right. Now, with rigging failures, they happen. You know, it's the same as any other type of tool. People don't always inspect their rigging, or they assume that they've used adequate straps. And you know, if you're not a competent rigger, you know, if you rig something incorrectly, sure, that sling may say that, hey, it'll hold 1,000 pounds, and that loads 800 pounds. Hey, we got 200 pounds extra. You know, depending on how you rig that up, you can actually derate that sling quite a bit. So, you know, there's always that potential to drop objects. Now, a couple years ago, I was working a project and you know, housekeeping actually came into play with falling objects. So we had some Boilermakers and pipe fitters. They had cut out a couple lengths of pipe. The outside diameter was about 4 inches, and they were about 6 foot in length. Now, here's what happened. Let me set this up for you. They had a pallet, and they had set the piping perpendicular to the slats in the piping. No type of chalking, nothing to stop them from rolling, and they placed them right next to a toe board, which was about the same height as that pallet, and there was nothing stopping them from rolling. And so these loose materials, when they started rolling, nothing stopped them from dropping 8 stories. And they fell into an area where there was actually a crew working earlier that day. Luckily, the foreman's kid that day got kicked out of school. All right, back to people can be stupid. Luckily for that, though, the foreman, he you know, pawned his employees off onto another work crew, helped them out, took them out of the area. You know, that one coincidence is all that stopped a fatality, possibly a couple of fatalities, because there were several people there. And, you know, lack of overhead protection. I was speaking with a safety professional last year, and we were discussing a fatality in New York City. And so here's what happened. There was a hanging scaffold 10 stories up, a support, just a little angle support fell 10 stories. And the first question that safety professional had was, well, why wasn't he wearing his hard hat? Now, if I hate to, you know, anybody who's relying on that hard hat to save you, let me point this out. So that scaffold bracket was about 5 to 8 pounds, give or take. It fell 10 stories at that point. That's falling with enough velocity. I don't care how good of a hard hat you have, that is not stopping that fatality right there, because that's a lot of force. And even if it doesn't crack through your hard hat and crack your skull, you know, that's still a lot of force that your neck has to endure. That's a broken neck. So when we talk about falling objects, a lot of people run to PPE first, and we say, hey, well, we need to have our hard hats on. And that's true. We have plenty of opportunity for falling objects, and that can range anywhere from somebody's tape measure or wrench falling a story, couple stories. You know, that could be that pipe falling. or that scaffold bracket. Now, in this case, there's all sorts of ways of protecting somebody from falling objects. You have systems that include nets, canopies. You know, there's lots of ways to protect. And these are some of the things you need to look at is the higher up your building, you know, the more potential that you have that something's going to fall. And what's amazing is it seems like no matter how hard you try, that wrench, that power drill, that socket set, it's amazing how quickly they can fall. And so that's why you need to make sure, you know, put some netting on your scaffolding. You know, that just increases the chance, or that decreases the chance something can fall between your mid rail and top rail. Now, when we talk about caught between, you know, when you're working in trenches and excavations, and I've never seen a construction project that did not have trenches or excavations, and when they fail, if we don't have the right protective systems in place, and remember this, any trench, any excavation will eventually fail. And if it does fail and we don't have those protective systems in place, we're going to be caught between both faces of that excavation as it caves in around us. And rotating equipment, you know, if you're caught with, you know, your clothes are caught, a fall protection harness is caught in rotating equipment, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be pulled into it. And that's just that much more, another hazard that, you know, well-intentioned employees, tradesmen and craftsmen, if you make that and that hazard finds you that day, that's very easily a fatality. And, you know, equipment rollovers, it happens. I can't tell you how many times I've been on a construction project, and if you'll think back to projects you've been on, seems like something rolls over at some point, whether it's a vehicle, a buggy. You have to be working on a pretty extreme slope for a bobcat, skid steer, or bulldozer to turn over. But you know what? It happens, all right? But equipment rolls over, and when it does, we need to have the appropriate rollover protection systems in place. And you know, there's even safeguards within a piece of equipment as simple as a seat belt to help you keep from getting thrown from that equipment and getting crushed by that equipment. Now, I'm going to give you just a few seconds. I just want you to look at this picture for just a moment, and I want you to just identify some of those focus 4 hazards that we've talked about. So I'm just going to give you 10 seconds, take a quick look at it, and then let's talk about what we see. All right, so, and it's okay if you didn't find every single hazard in this picture. I want to start off by saying, so our first focus 4 hazard, electrical. I really don't see a lot of electrical hazards in this photo. Now, if you look in the background of the photo, yes, you see power lines. They're not immediately near where we're working, but you know, as that excavator has to mobilize to and from where they store it, you know, we may have an exposure there. Let's talk about falls, though. All right, how many of y'all identified that fall hazard with the gentleman in the blue hard hat? So let's do some math real quick. And I can't tell you off the top of my head how tall that trench box is, but let's assume the gentleman in the green hard hat is only 5 foot tall. Now, he's standing on a culvert there that is probably about a 4 foot outer diameter. So now we have 9 foot. If you look, and it's kind of a judgment call here, but from the top of his hard hat, I'm guessing we have at least another foot to the top of that trench box. So we're looking anywhere from 10 to 12 foot. All right, now that's just a ballpark estimate, so forgive me if you disagree, but our gentleman in the blue hard hat, let me ask, what's really stopping him from actually falling? You know, he's standing at the edge of that pipe, sure. He's got his hand on it to steady himself, but that pipe's moving. And so if he loses his balance, we have that potential. Now, we also have the potential as we're climbing the ladder there, a little bit steep of a slope. Sure, they may have been able to do a little bit better, But, you know, again, even if it's set up 100% correct, we still have that fall hazard. And while it's not going to be a 6-foot fall, just bear in mind, we do have a pretty good break in elevation between the top and bottom of the pipe that our gentleman in the green hard hat's wearing. Now, struck by. Now, I talked about falling objects. How many of you spotted the second gentleman in that trench box? Right? If you look just to the right of the man with the green hard hat. Okay, so there's somebody down there, and what they're doing is they're going to put their hands on that culvert, on that pipe, and guide it into place. Now, he is standing right next to the edge. This is assuming his body's not underneath it. So let me ask you, what happens if the hydraulic controls in that excavator fail? You know, there's that possibility he could drop that load. Or what if one of the chain links fail in your lifting device? And if you've ever placed pipe like this, so the connection point on that pipe, it's actually a piece of rebar that's inside of that, that's cast in place. What if that rebar fails? All right, that is a fatality waiting to happen, same as the man falling. So right there, we have falls, we have struck by. How about caught in between? What if that pipe was to fall and it didn't hit that gentleman, but it was able to roll and pin in between the trench box and the pipe itself? You know, we have a lot of potentials here for fatalities, for serious injuries. And that's just out of the focus for, you know, there's other things that I'm sure you saw wrong with this picture. You'll notice on the left side of that trench box, that soil is placed all the way to the top of that trench box. Now, we need to have about 18 inches of the soil level beneath the top of that trench box. But that's just, again, there are several examples of accidents waiting to happen. And these are accidents that could change somebody's life forever if it doesn't take their life. And so when I talk about these hazards, I want you to bear in mind something. There's a lot more hazards in construction than just the 4 I've already talked about. You know, regardless of the industry, there's always going to be somebody painting. We always have those opportunities for fumes. And, you know, depending on the type of coating surfaces that you're working with, some have very high levels of VOCs. Some can be toxic until they finish curing. You know, we have a lot of ergonomic hazards within construction. You know, we're all the toughest men in the world in construction. You can't hurt us. We're made of steel. That being said, it's amazing. Ask a construction worker who's about 40, 50 years old. Ask a retired construction worker, how our knees and back feel? How our hands feel? Do we have arthritis? You know, using a jackhammer, using a lot of the tools that are just a part of our trade, you know, that's a lot of vibration that goes into our hands. And you know, there are permissible exposure limits for vibration with the tools that we work with. And that's something a lot of site plans don't address. A lot of companies, a lot of safety people, and I'm guilty of this too, we don't think about. And what about silica or biological hazards, you know, or just tool use, the tools of our trades? You know, there's a lot of hazards within construction outside of the Focus 4, and these are things that you have to take into account throughout the life of a project. Now, this is just a list of frequently cited violations in 2017. And there's several on here that relate back to our Focus 4 hazards. You know, we have everything from fall protection in residential construction. And bear in mind, a lot of safety people don't realize this. I've been told so many times there is no fall protection in residential construction. But look at that top one right there, fall protection, residential construction. You know, you may not always have ideal means of protecting people, but there's always a way, there's always a method to protect people. And that's where we get into the safety, written, documented safety plans, where we capture some of these unusual events. Now, ladders, and again, that goes under fall, you know, falls, PPE, aerial lifts, and that's something I didn't even discuss. Scaffolding, you know, there's a lot of things out there OSHA's looking at, and every single one of these, I'm sure between Rich and myself, we could tell you at least 1 or 2 incidents where somebody got hurt because they weren't following these codes. And I know it's always preachy to hear this. I hate saying it, but you know, the saying OSHA codes are written in blood, you know, the reality is that's true. And so every one of these citations right here or violations, you know what, this was an opportunity for somebody to get hurt. This was potentially an opportunity for somebody to get killed. Now, any site I've ever been on, you're going to have a site plan, a site-specific plan. Now, remember, I already mentioned this earlier. You're going to have a safety manual. You're going to have a documented program, all right, or at least you should. Now, that being said, you're always going to have a plan. How are we going to implement this program on our site? Now, I've spent time on behalf working for subcontractors. I've worked for the construction managers and general contractors, and I've worked on behalf of the client. And you'll see clients will have their own safety plans. Now, usually those are very basic, not always. You know, they'll definitely at minimum meet OSHA standards. Sometimes they'll exceed it a little bit. Now, as a contractor, you need to have one. This is typically something you're going to submit to your general contractor or to your client. Now, here are 4 things you need to have in your site-specific safety plan. Now, first and foremost, you want to address your management's commitment and how employees are going to be involved. Now, anyone who knows me, who's ever gone through one of my training classes, I can't tell you how many times I've started a conversation or a training class pointing out I'm a stupid safety guy. And what really bothers me is my boss is in the room and he's not arguing with me at this point. So that must mean there's a little truth there. But, you know, one of the greatest learning tools I've ever had is just approaching a tradesman and being honest. I do not know your trade. That's what I know about steel erection, iron work. You know, I learned that from iron workers who are usually very standoffish with safety people. They don't like somebody who's going to tell them, wait, that's not right. Because again, that's a trade that, you know what, they're okay with that risk. They're okay with those hazards. In fact, a lot of them, it's almost a thrill to them to show up to work every day. You know what, just talking to people on your job site, you know, that will open up your eyes to trade-specific hazards. That'll open up your eyes to things that maybe we're not getting right on the project. And it's amazing how much pride a tradesman will take, you know, when he sees somebody cares about his opinion. Somebody cares about his idea and is willing to present that to a manager. And you know, when people get that involvement, it's amazing how quickly they'll get behind you and help push, you know, a cultural change. Now, when it comes to dealing with upper management, and you know, a lot of people say, hey, safety culture starts at the top and trickles down to the bottom. I've heard people make great arguments for no, it starts at the bottom and moves upwards. You know, it's kind of a two-way street. It really is. And you know, when you get employees involved, and again, you want to document how you're going to do that, whether it's through observation cards, stop cards, whether it's just through your interactions. But it's amazing when you take a problem and present it to a superintendent, present it to a project manager, or whatever level of management you're answering to. And after you present them with this problem, and they understand the problem, they understand the risk, and you present a common sense solution that makes sense, that's gonna allow a tradesman to work, that's not gonna handicap him, it's amazing how you can get that management commitment. And so, you know, in your site plan, yes, you want to have a signature from your managers, from your project managers, your superintendents, maybe even your general foremans that say, hey, we support safety on this project, but you want to make sure you document their responsibilities and you document how you're going to get that employee involvement. Now, the next thing that OSHA recommends, and I recommend myself in a effective safety plan, is going to be this, a work site analysis. Now, there's several ways you can go about conducting a work site analysis. I'm not going to get into every single one of them because we could be here for a while just talking about that. But if you don't know your trades, if you don't know your scope of work, if you haven't sat down as a team and discussed the hazards of this project, discussed what can happen on this project, and agreed, here's what we need to do, here's our controls, you know what? You're setting yourself up for failure right there. Because again, While I'm a big believer in you don't know what you don't know, if you don't ask that question, if you don't, if you don't use the resources that are available to you, and I believe project managers, superintendents, they are great resources in analyzing your project because, same as you, they've done this before, but they have a little bit different perspective on safety. And so they can be a great tool in really analyzing the hazards you're going to have on this project. And again, back to when you include people and you listen to that project manager, you listen to that superintendent, back to when they get involved, they see, hey, you're listening, you care about my opinion, you're taking what I have to say seriously. It's amazing, again, how much commitment you can really drive just through a worksite analysis. Now, when we understand the hazards, we understand from phase to phase what can happen, we understand the severity versus the probability. At this point, there's always rules in safety. It never fails. Again, it's just the nature of what we do. And so we have to have those site-specific rules tailored to our site where we look at how do we prevent and how do we control our exposures, regardless of what type of hazard it is. And something, again, I've noticed, a lot of site safety plans I've seen, when I'm asked to review them, 90% of them are the same. And what happens, a lot of people get complacent and they don't update a site safety plan from site to site, from project to project. Instead, they take one from a former employer. They download one online. They look at sample plans from OSHA's website and, they put their name on it and they submit it to a client. And I've actually asked contractors that have worked for me in the past, okay, well, I see you doing this, you're waiting until 6 foot to use your fall protection, but in your site safety plan, you say 4 foot. Well, as the client, guess what I'm going to hold you to? I'm going to hold you to the contractual documents. And in our safety clause, it says, we're going to follow either your policies and procedures, or we're going to follow mine, whichever is more stringent. And I've had that happen where contractors didn't even realize what was in their own safety plan. And so that's why it's important. Let's identify our hazards. Let's identify our controls, and let's make sure our site-specific safety plan. Let's hit the intent of that. It needs to be specific. And you want to talk about training in your plans. Now, I was teaching a class on forklifts last week, and there were some statistics that OSHA has put out there. And what they were stating was, and I don't know the exact numbers, but what they stated was, with good, effective training and with evaluating operators on forklifts, OSHA felt that it could eliminate around, I want to say it was 11 fatalities a year involving forklifts in general industry. Now, they didn't say they would eliminate all fatalities, all right? That's why it's important, if you're just going through the motions with training, if you don't understand that equipment, if you don't understand that process, those procedures and why they're in place, it's kind of hard to be effective. Now, again, another observation I've had, and this goes across the board with just about every trade I've worked around. It is very easy when you take a journeyman, let's say a journeyman Boilermaker, worked in construction all his life, has 10, 15, 20 years experience, and you go to start asking them questions, let's say about an anchorage point. And the reason you're asking him about this is because you noticed, wait a minute, his anchorage point is a 1-inch electrical conduit and it's live. Now, again, if you've worked with fall protection, you already know what's wrong with that statement. And when you start asking them these questions, you'll hear a couple different answers. Sometimes it's, well, what else do I tie off to, Mr. Safety Man? How do I protect myself from this fall? Sometimes they may genuinely not recognize this is a bad anchorage point. And this is where effective training comes into place. All right. And that example right there, other safety persons, and I've been guilty of this earlier on in my safety career, where I assume people know what they're doing. And while I'll always say a tradesman knows his job better than me, it is still my role to make sure that they recognize the hazards with their task and they understand how to identify those hazards, how to work around them, and when to say it's time to stop and let's ask for help, whether that's from another tradesman, a foreman, or if they want to come to me. Now, I said I'd talk about enforcement, and there's a lot of factors that go into enforcement. Now, while I have culture listed here, I want to make sure you understand as a safety professional what role you have in the culture and enforcement of safety. Now, if you're running around catching people, you're dishing out the punishment, you're judge, jury, and executioner, you know what? You're a cop. And if you're a cop, you're not going to go very far, I promise you that. Especially if you work with iron workers, structural bolts fall, so you might want to be careful being a cop on the job site. You need to be mentoring people. And when I say mentoring people, that's not just your tradesmen. You need to mentor them. You need to mentor your supervisors, your foremen, your general foreman. You need to make sure you're mentoring your management team, your PMs, your superintendents. Because, again, you don't want to assume that they understand what their role is in safety. And, you know, every industry you go to is going to have a little bit different of a culture. You know, refining has the reputation of being very strict. You know what? If you've been in the refining atmosphere, a lot of the rules that we have in refining, you know what? They make sense once somebody's explained it to you. Once you've heard about accidents that inspired those rules and ways of thinking. Whereas you move into, let's say, still in the oil and gas sector, pipeline. I love listening to pipeliners complain about refining. And when you ask them what's wrong with refining, oh, there's too many rules and this is pipeline. We don't do it that way. And you know what? Again, there are rules that make sense in refining that doesn't make sense in pipeline. But you have to remember that the industry you're working in is going to have its own culture. And when we're working construction, you know, again, our culture, we're tough. It's just a little cut. Hey, that's no big deal. And now you add into the mix a company's culture. You know, I've seen some companies that truly cared. You know, they wanted their management systems to be right. They wanted to get safety right. That being said, you have a lot of things potentially working for you, a lot of things working potentially against you. So you have to recognize that enforcement, culture, they can go hand in hand. Now, when I talk about enforcement, I don't mean, again, discipline, not at first. Now, management, ultimately, they're the ones who need to support it, because you can't tell me that every employee makes good decisions 100% of the time. You cannot tell me, and if you do, I won't believe you, that there are not times where people know the rule, but they violate it intentionally because they have work they need to get done. They don't see the point in that rule. Now, your management team, they need to support your supervision when they feel that they need to write somebody up. And your supervisors, you know, some supervisors a little bit stronger in their leadership skills than others. So that being said, you know, when you have a weaker supervisor as a safety person, you know what your role is? Give them leadership. All right, that's your role throughout the safety process, throughout your safety program. Yes, we have actions we need to take. We're in the business of finding things wrong. We're in the business of addressing them. But you need to work through your supervisors and your management team as well as with your tradesmen. Now, the process of enforcement is very simple. You need to train people. Back to something I said earlier, you don't know what you don't know. And so if a tradesman doesn't know any better, how can you expect him to meet your expectations? Now, let's say you've trained him, but you go out and you see him not working properly. You know, the second step of enforcement is making sure that that tradesman understands what you're taught him. And if you do any type of supervision training, that goes down to the mentorship, function for your supervisors and management. When you see that they may not understand, yes, you need to address that. You need to coach and mentor them as well. And finally, when you train somebody, you verified they understood, you retrained them, whether in the field, whether it was a formal classroom setting, and yet they still can't get it through their heads that they need to behave in a certain manner, you know what? That's where we start getting into disciplinary action, because that's the point you're starting to tell me as a tradesman, you know what? I know the rule, but I'm choosing not to follow it. And while I never want to see somebody lose their job as a result of safety, it's always my goal to see somebody get it. Not everybody will get it. Sometimes, you know what? Hey, they need to be written up, given a few days off, and boom, they're in their mind, whether they get it or not, they're going to follow the rules. And some people, I hate to say it, if I've done my due diligence, my supervisors have done their due diligence, you know what? If you're going to get yourself killed on a job, I don't want it to be my job. Now, a great buzzword that everyone throws out in safety is this: behavioral-based safety. Now, let me make sure you understand the concept of it. Now, Rich, I'm going to pick on you for just a second. So you asked me to put this PowerPoint presentation together. Now, did you ask me, did you care if I was excited about putting this PowerPoint presentation together?
Absolutely not.
All right. Thank you for that, Rich. All right. Did you care how much satisfaction I got in putting this PowerPoint together and giving this webinar today?
Yeah, I did, actually.
I love it when you lie to me, Rich.
I did.
But what's your focus? You had to see this get done.
Right.
And you had to have this webinar. So in the end, if you had to choose, I finished this and I put on a good webinar, or I was miserable the whole time and I didn't get it done, which is your focus there?
Well, I wanted you to put on a good webinar.
All right, exactly. So that being said, all right, a lot of people focus on attitude. Hey, I want to change your attitude. And you know, if I can change your attitude and make you comply and you're happy about it, I am excited by that. But in the end, and a lot of us safety people have said this, I don't care if you like me. I need you to follow the rules. I need you to understand you have to do this. And you know, hey, sometimes we are the bad guys. You know, I said, hey, I don't want you to be a safety cop. Hey, there are those times we have to do that. It's just unfortunate, but it happens. But you need to make sure everything you do is not necessarily designed to change somebody's attitude, but you want to change their behavior. Now, the two can go hand in hand, especially if you're, you know, if you're doing observations, and especially if you're interacting with your tradesmen, you're asking them good questions, you're giving them the chance to interact. Same with your management team. That's what behavioral-based safety is. It's changing behaviors. And the greatest tools I've always found were this: not to manage from my office, but instead get out there, interact with people. And this needs to be something, again, that's a buzzword. People throw it out a lot. They write it up in their safety plans, and they don't understand it. But this needs to be an element in your site safety plan, in your program as a whole across the board, that you understand we address and we get right. So I talked about quite a bit over the past hour. And just to kind of recap, you know, in construction, the same hazard 15 minutes from now may be a little bit different. Hey, the wind direction changed, my body position changed. Hey, instead of this industry, I'm working in that industry. The project's a little different. You know, change is just consistent and constant in construction. And that's kind of what makes it hard to manage sometimes, because back to we're relying on people to make good decisions. And you know, there are a lot of hazards out there, and I talked about 4 of them, focus 4 hazards, that you can make one mistake one time, and that could be enough to change your life, injure you, permanently disable you, or kill you. And that's why it's important, you know, when you're going into a project, you need to plan appropriately, and you need to understand, you know, with enforcement, we need to train people. That is a foundation of enforcement. And if we're not training people, we're not verifying they understand, you know, at this point, we're just developing almost a police state. And that's not fair to your tradesmen. It's not going to be effective for you, and you're not going to be able to build a good, safe construction culture. And I promise you, if you approach a job correctly, even if you don't 100% understand all the little hazards with a specific trade, again, if you, as the leadership of your site culture, if you are open in communication, you're willing to work with people, you know what? You can build a great culture on your project, and you know what? It's doable regardless of what industry you're in and what the project is.
All right, with that, I would like to open it up to any questions that anybody might have. Understand that this was a very high-level perspective on safety. One of the things that Jim didn't touch on that I do want to touch on just real quickly is understanding that even if you work in a manufacturing setting, the construction regulations may or may not apply to the work that you guys are doing in your facility. Typically, we run into this with maintenance personnel. For example, you are going to remodel a bathroom, or you're going to repaint your facility. Then if you're going to do something like that, then that's going to fall under the construction regulations. And there are some differences between the regulations. A lot of similarities, a lot of crossover, but there are some differences, especially when we get into terms of fall protection and some stuff like that. If you're interested in finding out any more about this or getting into a deeper dive on the construction industry regulations, as you can see on the screen, we are doing an OSHA 10-hour construction safety class here in a couple weeks in the Cardinal office. We still have some seats available in that. It's a very reasonable cost. Normally it's $89. If you email me and you're interested in it, I can give you a discount code. Or I'll just tell you, how about I just tell you here, if you go on there and you register and you type in Safety Matters, that's capital SAFETY, capital MATTERS, that will get you a discount to $59 per seat, which is a really good deal for that course. There's no space in between Safety and Matters. We also have some classes coming up, how to conduct workplace audits, combustible dust, and then one on, it's actually supposed to be May 23rd, not March 23rd, about handling the aftermath of an OSHA inspection. And if you're interested in any of these classes or any of the classes on the right that we're going to conduct, that we're conducting, please visit our website, www.cardinalhs.net. With that, looks like we do not have any questions, so I'm going to wrap this up. Once again, if you would like to receive a certificate for this webinar, please email me at rich@cardinalhs.net. And with that, I would like to thank everybody for your attention today, and have a wonderful and safe day.